In the last video, I showed you how to listen to your heart. And another common question is, how do you follow your heart? So you see, following your heart starts with listening to your heart. So if you haven't watched that video, how to listen to your heart, go ahead and watch that video. And now that you're listening to your heart, what does it mean to follow your heart? What does that mean when I say follow your heart? You start by listening to your heart. And like I said in that last video, you're listening to that silence. That silence is your heart. That silence is also stillness. The stillness and silence of your heart. And you will find that the more you are listening to it and resting in the heart, the more it feels like you have, metaphorically speaking, your finger on the pulse. And what you experience is this aliveness that spontaneously arises and wants to express itself. Now, this expression can look like anything. And you are simply following this aliveness by allowing this aliveness to be expressed. This aliveness that I'm speaking of, sometimes referred to as excitement, enthusiasm, passion, or love. When someone says, follow your passion, or follow your enthusiasm, or follow your bliss, follow your heart, these are all pointing to the same things, or the same thing. But by listening to your heart, you are now experiencing that aliveness that spontaneously arises out of that stillness, out of that silence. And this is the expression of your heart. Now, like I said in the last video, we're usually listening to the mind. All of this conditioning, what your parents have told you, what your friends have told you, schooling has told you, government, society, culture. And this is what we're used to listening to. But when you start listening to your heart, you're now guided by your heart. Your heart is leading the way, and it leads the way via this aliveness, that you're following this aliveness. And this aliveness spontaneously arises within you. It feels like something wells up within you, something that is bursting. It feels a lot like something wants to be birthed. Something wants to be created. Something wants to be expressed. And it feels a lot like it's overflowing and just needs to come out. So in the last video, I spoke about how we are typically ignoring this silence of the heart. We're ignoring our heart. So instead of listening to our heart, we're listening to the mind. which means that we're listening to our parents, our friends, society, culture. We're listening to all of this influence. And if we're ignoring our heart, then it feels like we're disconnected. Now, once we start listening to our heart and feeling this aliveness arise, this aliveness wants to be expressed. So this stillness is much like the potentiality. It's the potential. And this aliveness, as it arises, wants to be expressed. And this is like the actuality. So there's the potentiality and the actuality. Anything that's expressed is an actualization of this potential. So as you are feeling this aliveness within you, you feel as if something is coming through you. Something wants to be expressed. Whatever it is, cooking, starting a garden, playing music, perhaps just a different route to work, doing something different. But what you usually notice is it's something different. It's very spontaneous. So it's very different than the mind, because the mind is very cyclical. It's very conditioned. It's patterned. But when you're listening to your heart, you're tuning into that which is not mind. So it's always going to be unknown, different, new, fresh. It's not going to be of the conditioned mind. It's going to be authentic. It's going to be genuine. This aliveness is an authentic expression of yourself. That when it's actualized, you are actualizing your authentic self. This aliveness is expressed, and it's as if your authentic self is shining. Now, just like I said in the last video, is we're typically not listening to our heart because we're listening to the mind. And it's also possible to listen to your heart, but not follow your heart. And this is because there's suppression. So this aliveness arises and feels sort of like an impulse, like something wants to come through. Something wants to be expressed. But at this stage of not really following the heart, it's because that connection, we could say, is weak, in the sense that we're still very used to listening to the mind, so there's a sort of doubt. We don't trust ourselves. So this aliveness comes up. Perhaps it's following your passion for painting. But then there's a suppression. And the suppression is always fear. There's always fear of following our heart. Because following our heart is very unknown. It's unknown to the mind. The mind is conditioned, it's predictable. It feels safe because it's known. But the heart is unknown. And a lot of times it feels risky. This is why there's a sense of aliveness with risk. There's a sense of adventure when you're following the heart. Following your heart is an adventure. Now, an adventure has no destination. The mind is very linear. It's sequential. If I follow these 5 steps, I'm going to get here. But following your heart is very spontaneous. And there's no destination. It's just an authentic expression in this present moment. That you're expressing that aliveness moment to moment. And for one that's following their heart, there's no next. It's always now. So when there's this doubt, this fear, there's the suppression of the heart. There's suppressing our authentic self. Now, this doesn't feel good. Any form of suppression doesn't feel good. When you're suppressing your authentic self wants to shine through, express, a genuine expression. But when there's fear, what are they going to think? What if this doesn't work out? What if that? I shouldn't do this. I can't do that. Then it's a lot like you're suppressing yourself, because you are. So following your heart is really allowing that aliveness to be expressed. You're listening to the silence and the stillness of the heart, which is the potentiality, and then you feel this aliveness wants to be expressed. And that is really following your heart. Moment to moment, because you have your finger on the pulse, sort of say, you can feel that. It's as if you can feel that heartbeat, that aliveness. So whatever excites you, whatever is your highest joy, greatest interest, this enthusiasm, this passion, this love, then that is simply expressed. And that expression then is the action. So whatever the activity is, perhaps you're really passionate about gardening. So then that gardening becomes that activity. But it's an expression of your heart. Maybe it's walking in nature. Maybe it's cooking. Whatever it is then an authentic expression of yourself. And you're feeling this aliveness. And you're just simply allowing it to come through. This is what feels so natural. That's why suppressing ourselves feels unnatural. It doesn't feel good. But just simply allowing that aliveness to be expressed is following your heart. That following your heart is really about no longer suppressing it. Just like listening to your heart is simply to stop ignoring it. So then you find that your life becomes more and more authentic. It's more and more an authentic expression of yourself. When we're always suppressing ourselves, trying to copy somebody else, it's always going to feel unnatural. It's always going to feel disingenuous, like a fake, inauthentic. I'm doing this, but I just want to fit in with that crowd. I'm doing this because I don't really want to stand out, be unique. But you see that your authentic self is unique. It's one of a kind. So by expressing yourself authentically, it's going to be different than anything that you see. This is why it takes courage to follow your heart. So your life then starts becoming more and more an authentic expression of you. And you'll see by following your heart, there's certain activities that sort of fall away that you're not interested in because it just doesn't feel authentic to you. It might feel like they fall away because at a time you were doing those activities just to fit in, just to be like others. And this is a lot of that conditioning, these conditioned activities. But now that you're listening to your heart, you're not outsourcing things. You're not asking your friends and your family and other people what you should do. No, because when you're following your heart, you're guided by your heart. It's your heart's expression that is the doing. So the activities that you are doing are an authentic expression of your true self. This feels natural, feels authentic, feels genuine, feels pure. You'll start feeling that certain things just don't align with yourself anymore. When you start following your heart, you'll feel like certain activities you just can't do that anymore. So like this, things just naturally fall away. And as those things fall away, that which remains is your true self. That which remains is your authentic self. So it's not like you're becoming your authentic self, it's always present. This falling away is a sort of refinement. Your authentic self is always here, always now. But as this layer of conditioning is falling away, as you stop suppressing yourself, then it appears like you are becoming more and more authentic. But really, it's that you're simply allowing yourself to be you. This is what self-love really is. Self-love is being yourself. To be yourself is freedom. This freedom of expression. Is the same as saying to live fully. You're following your heart moment to moment by just simply allowing it to express. And this could look like anything. This is why you can't compare yourself to somebody else. No matter if you see them as enlightened or a teacher or sage or whatever it is. That our true self expresses itself uniquely. Every expression is going to be unique. This expression here will not be the same as that expression there. You could say they're two expressions of the one, but on the level of expression, they are one of a kind, which means it cannot be compared. And how the one expresses itself as the multiplicity and diversity that you see. Is actually the individuality. And that's what is the highest form of expression. That allowing yourself to simply be you and express yourself authentically is to actually express your individuality to the fullest. But any sort of suppression would be a hindrance to that expression. And as you start following your heart, you start to get a sense for when there still is that suppression. It feels very unnatural. Feel very dualistic in the sense of, should I do it? Should I not? Whereas actually following your heart is non-dual. When you're following your heart, you don't even see choices. We see choices when we're following the mind. It's always this or that. When we're following our heart, there's just this. There's just this. There's just this. You don't see options. When we're following the mind, there's a sense of being stuck. That's why people say, I'm stuck in my head. I'm just trying to weigh out the decision here. Second guessing myself. But when you're following your heart, it's not like that. There's just the action. There's no second guessing it. There's no regretting the action. When you're following your heart, there's a knowing without mind. It's not like you're receiving verbal instruction. It's very intuitive. This inner knowing, this knowing without mind, the knowing of the heart, that it knows the way. And once you start listening to your heart, you start feeling that you're guided. And the more you're listening to your heart, the more you're following your heart, the more you start having this trust in that inner guide. The heart is intelligence. This intelligence is beyond the mind. Any sort of doubt or lack of trust is to not trust this intelligence. But this intelligence is the one intelligence. It's the intelligence of life. It's the intelligence that's making it rain, shining the sun, growing the grass, creating a baby. So you can trust your heart. And along this journey, it's as if you start listening to your heart. And the more you're listening to the heart, the more you start following it. And the more you start following it, the more you start trusting it. And the more you start trusting your heart, the more you're letting go of the mind. The more you're letting go of that conditioning. And the more you're letting go of that conditioning, then what's remaining is your authentic self, is your unconditional self. What remains is that which is present prior to the conditioning. That your unconditional self starts shining through. So on the journey, it appears that you're becoming more of yourself, but it's more that this conditioning is sort of dissolving or falling away or becoming thinner. Because your authentic self is ever present, but we could say it's just covered up by this conditioning. As this conditioning thins out, then it's as if your authentic self is just shining through more and more. This conditioning becomes very thin, transparent. It's lighter, it's not so heavy. At the start of the journey, it's as if you didn't even know your authentic self. It's like it's buried, disconnected from it. Sometimes the disconnect is so great that it feels foreign. It doesn't even feel like me. And it's because we're so used to the conditioned mind. We're so used to listening to the mind that we don't even listen to that silence of the heart. We're so used to following the conditioned mind, what everyone's saying. We're so used to following the crowd that we get lost in the crowd. But once you start listening to your heart and following your heart, you're no longer lost in the crowd. There's an intelligence that you're listening to, that you're following. And where a lot of people on the journey have troubles is that inner guide is guiding you in such a radical way. It's so different than what you see. It's so different than your friends and your family, your society, your culture. It's so different than everything else. So there's a natural, I shouldn't say natural, but there's this tendency, this habit of not listening, not following your heart, and going back to the crowd. This is where I said there's that suppression. But it's as if it gets louder and louder. It's as if your heart's saying, you can't ignore me anymore. And it usually shows up in the way of life crisis. Things are happening to get your attention. The suffering is increasing because you're not paying attention. So it's a way to come back to the heart. To come back to yourself. And ultimately to live as your true self. Hopefully this helps. See you in the next one.